Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. This is part 2, so if you've not seen part 1, you can go back and watch that afterwards if you're live or later, whenever. But this is part 2, where we're looking at the Protestant Reformation with Professor Alec Ryrie of Gresham College lecture fame, for those of you who kind of recommended your content to me in the first place. So today we're just going to be picking up where we kind of left off in the story. So we talked about Martin Luther and the initial kind of seeds of the Reformation, and then we talked a bit about Calvinism in Geneva, and now I think we're going to talk about some of the other kind of elements that are a part of this thing that we call the Reformation. So what's going on in England at the time and Great Britain?
Well, the English story is a kind of weird tangent to a lot of this. And England is a country that never should have had a Reformation. It's one of the countries which is one of the most centrally governed anywhere in Europe at the time. It's got a very powerful monarchy. It's also got experience of dealing with heresy. The so-called Lollard movement has been kind of grumbling away in the background for the last century or so without ever getting anywhere near any kind of real influence. And the church is in unusually good shape. It's well disciplined, it's well led. This isn't a place which is beset by the obvious signs of corruption which helped to win Luther a hearing in large parts of Europe. So what happens is that some English scholars and merchants, folks who've got continental contacts, pick up some interest in the new ideas in the 1520s. So there's a flurry of activity in England's two universities, particularly in Cambridge. And then pretty fast, the English church and state catches wind of this. Its heresy hunting machine grinds into action, and it starts suppressing this movement. And there are a dozen or so executions over the course of the late 1520s, 1530s. And really that should have been the end of the story.
And those executions, sorry, are they approximately to do with like people translating the Bible into English, or what's going on there? I mean, just briefly.
Sure. Okay. I mean, these are people who are being executed under English law for the crime of heresy. And so this is a kind of hybrid state between secular law, which authorizes it, but and ultimately carries out the executions, but it's investigated by the bishops using the structures of ecclesiastical law. So it's in legal terms, it's a kind of strange crossover. And what that means is that they are being found to be persistent in willful error, despite being corrected for those grave errors. That is not so much asserting that the Bible should be translated into English. That is, making an English translation of the Bible is illegal. England is really the only major jurisdiction in which vernacular translations of the Bible are illegal in the late Middle Ages. But more significantly, it's for holding specific Protestant doctrines. So justification by faith alone, denying transubstantiation, the classic Catholic doctrine of the Mass, denying the supremacy of the Pope. This series of other core doctrinal assertions that Protestants are making. Denying the existence of purgatory is a big one. And so these folks are being rounded up, and when they refuse to recant their errors, they are given a chance to save their lives by renouncing their errors. Those who refuse to do so ultimately face execution. This is a pretty well-established heresy hunting method. The English bishops are a bit surprised that these new heretics turn out to be a lot more stubborn than the ones they're used to dealing with. The long-standing English heretics, largely you arrest them, and put the frighteners on them and they'll give in. This lot are rather more willing to go to the stake, which is a bit unnerving. But nevertheless, that's how the system works. And if it hadn't been for the fact that right at this moment, King Henry VIII had got himself into a really difficult fight with the Pope, out of which there is no good way, then that would have been the end of the story. But for reasons that are all too well known, Henry comes up against one of the very few undisputed powers of the papacy, that is its authority over matrimonial law. Finds himself, for complicated reasons, wanting to challenge those powers head on rather than try and find a clever technical legal way through it, as his advisors are urging him to. And ends up really painting himself into a corner, such that by the late 1530, early 1531, he really has convinced himself not just that his marriage, his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, was never legal in the first place, because she'd previously been married to his brother, but also he becomes genuinely convinced in the core of his being that the papacy which had authorized that marriage is therefore demonstrating itself to be illicit and to have no authority. And he becomes profoundly convinced, I mean, this is that really becomes the heart of his religion from here on, that he himself, Henry Tudor, has been appointed by God as the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, immediately under Christ. And that anybody who refuses to accept that authority, or who wants to insist that the Pope, this foreign bishop, has some authority in England, is a traitor, is trying to usurp his powers.
What is it that kind of instigates that change in? Because previously, I mean, hasn't he been called like a defender of the faith or something by the Pope?
Yeah. I mean, he's very against Luther and his doctrine of justification by faith, in particular that doctrine, because it sounds to him like a license to commit sin. And Henry's very keen on punishment for sin, not so much if it's his own sin, but certainly as far as his subjects are concerned. He likes a nice, clear system of reward and punishment. So the Protestant doctrine, with all this emphasis on free forgiveness, he finds very unsettling. Plus, he's very loyal to the traditional sacramental structures of the Catholic Church. And the book that he writes with some considerable assistance, but nevertheless, it's his project against Luther. It is called "I Assert That There Are Seven Sacraments." It's a defense of the sacraments, and it is effectively negotiated in advance that if he writes this book, he's going to get a title from the Pope. He's been unhappy for a long time that the King of France has a papal title, the King of Spain has a papal title, King of England doesn't have one. He feels that he deserves something of the same level of dignity. He's always been a king who has been keen to take a stand on his own authority, although that's hardly unusual for kings. It's this particular dispute about his marriage and his absolute refusal to budge on that, the way that it seems to him to reveal this deeper flaw in the papacy's authority. It happens quite suddenly. We can spot the point at which he tips over from just pursuing an argument about the marriage to having, as it seems to him, his eyes open, and it's been compared to a religious conversion. And I think that's pretty persuasive.
And he justifies this story through scripture. Does he kind of have a perspective shift in how he's doing theologies?
I mean, I've slightly struggled to describe what he's doing as theology. Sorry, I'm not that much of a fan of the man. But yeah, I mean, there is that kind of breakthrough in it, and certainly for him, Scripture is important, and reading the works of some of the early Protestants and listening to some of the people around him who've been reading them, not least his intended next wife, Anne Boleyn, is important in pushing him towards this. He develops this, I mean, almost kind of charmingly naive conviction that the doctrine of his royal supremacy is so self-evident in Scripture that if the Bible is published in English and freely set forth and his subjects read it, then they will all be convinced of it too. And he becomes genuinely dismayed a little later on when the Bible is published in English and it turns out that not everybody reads it the same way he does. But for all that he becomes an enthusiast for the English Bible, he's never a Protestant. At best, he forms a kind of alliance of convenience with them. Although he still profoundly disagrees with their doctrines in a number of areas, the one thing that they and he absolutely have in common is that they all hate the Pope and want to get rid of papal authority. And for them, that's enough. They're willing to go along with this. You know, he's getting rid of the Pope. He's publishing an English Bible. You know, they can cross their fingers about the rest and hope that it'll come round. For him, he's willing to work with these folks because as much as he may dislike some of their doctrines, on this one key issue, for him, the decisive religious point, they are on his side. And many of the other folks in his church who go along with his vendetta with the Pope, he doesn't really trust them. And so, you know, one of the crucial points of this comes, you know, just as this his campaign, his conflict with the Pope is kind of coming to a climax in 1532. The long-serving Archbishop of Canterbury, William Wareham, dies. Wareham had backed the King's campaign over the divorce, but is becoming increasingly uneasy about the way this is turning into a war against the Church, showing alarming signs of listening to his conscience. When he dies, the king is absolutely clear that the new person he wants in that role as Archbishop has got to be someone he can absolutely trust, whose commitment to opposing the papacy is heartfelt and unquestioned. And so he does the only thing he can. He appoints a convinced Protestant, this relatively obscure churchman, Thomas Cranmer, who the king had come to work with over the past couple of years, and who he's come to develop a deep personal trust in. And so Cranmer, to his own and everybody else's surprise, is plucked out of obscurity and made Archbishop of Canterbury, because the king absolutely needs somebody in that role who, when he's called on to make the final judgment about the king's marriage, is going to make the right decision. And that's a kind of symbol of the deal that he ends up making. By putting Cranmer and others like him in positions of power so that he's got allies against the papacy, he ends up bringing people who are serious about their Protestantism into the heart of the English establishment. And when Henry himself dies in January 1547, many of those Protestants whom he's promoted, people who he's brought along because ultimately they hate the Pope as much as he does, they're still there. And they're the ones who then fully take over and end up setting England on a much more kind of straightforwardly and unambiguously Protestant path.
So what does this English Protestant theology look like then? I mean, what are the kind of views that someone like Cranmer would hold? You know, how does it compare and contrast to maybe the views of like Luther and Calvin?
It's a good question, and it's a bit of a moving target. And I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds on this, because you're now kind of getting into the area I did my own PhD research on years ago. So, you know, if I dive too deep, just like kind of grab me by the back of my neck and pull me out of here. In the 1530s, in that sort of first phase of the English Reformation, there's a sense amongst the Protestants in the regime that time is ultimately on their side, that the king is moving in their direction, making many of the changes they want to make, legalizing the English Bible, he's getting rid of monasteries. They think that even if he doesn't fully agree with them yet, they can work on him. Patience and things are going to go their way. Then in 1539-40, thereon, there's a real change of tempo. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, the one who's really the sort of legal architect of that first phase of the English Reformation, of course, who's Hilary Mantel has sort of brought back to our consciousness. He's executed, and there's a sense then that actually this king is not really on our side. We may be able to work on him, but he's a bit of a loose cannon. And especially after a couple of surges of persecution and repression of Protestantism, one in 1543, another round in 1546, a lot of English Protestants, and this includes Archbishop Cranmer himself, actually come to the conviction that the kind of moderate, patient approach, work with the government, which is much more aligned with a sort of Lutheran style of reform, is no longer tenable. And they find themselves embracing the more politically aggressive and in some ways more doctrinally purist ideas coming out of Switzerland and southern Germany. It'd be a bit anachronistic at this point to call them Calvinists, because Calvin doesn't really have that level of reputation yet. But that world of people who are wanting to keep the church more separate from the state with its own power, and who are also wanting to clear out the remains of Catholic sacramental doctrine much more thoroughly. And it's just at this point, when the English Protestantism becomes radicalized in this way, it's just at this point that the king dies, and they end up inheriting the keys to the kingdom. So I really think if things had been different by a few months, we could have had a different sort of result. But it means that the Protestant clique that end up taking power in early 1547 in the name of the boy king Edward VI are a Protestant clique who by then have become pretty much capital R Reformed Protestants, what we would quickly move on to call Calvinists. And just to reinforce that, there's a political crisis on the continent at the time. A number of the Protestants of that style particularly find themselves having to flee their homes. Cranmer says, come here, and ends up staffing his newly reformed English church with a series of some of the great theologians of Protestant Europe. It's a real coup for him to get some of these people. And they arrive to this country, which is a bit of a backwater, and put its theologians sort of gently but firmly through a quick boot camp in Protestant theology. And it means that by the end of Edward's reign, by 1552, 1553, the identity of the English church with that reformed camp is pretty clear. There is then, of course, the whole episode of Queen Mary's accession. England returns to Catholicism in 1553. If she had lived, that would probably have worked. There's been lots of debate over that in the last few years, but she doesn't. She dies childless 5 years later for complicated reasons of dynastic and international power politics. The throne ends up passing to Henry's surviving daughter Elizabeth, who's a funny sort of Protestant, but she is a Protestant, and the only allies she's got are Protestants of the kind who saw Edward's church, this reformed church, as the model that they wanted to follow. And so, more or less, whether she wants it or not, that's the kind of church that she has to end up accepting. But she doesn't entirely like it. And that means that one or two traditional peculiarities hang on. It retains a rather conservative-looking liturgy. She holds on to these peculiar establishment, the cathedrals, which don't really serve any purpose in a Reformed church, but they are, their primary purpose really is musical and liturgical, and Elizabeth likes that kind of thing.
But no slides. No slides, and merry-go-rounds.
She likes, she's got really rather sort of conservative and traditional aesthetic tastes. And she's also, and this is a very monarchical opinion, she's determined to retain control of the church herself rather than to let it become a properly freewheeling reformed church which elects its own leaders.
Like a
so she wants no presbyteries, because she wants to retain bishops. The great thing about bishops is not only are they dignified and quasi-royal, like lords, but they're appointed by the Queen. This is about royal control. And so England winds up with a church with an unquestionably reformed Calvinist settlement, but one that's not properly finished. And that means that in later generations, it's possible for a new mood to emerge within parts of this new entity, which starts calling itself with tremendous arrogance the Church of England. That a new mood starts to appear in it, who are saying, well, actually, we're not just holding on to these conservative relics, bishops, cathedrals, the Book of Common Prayer, just because the Queen says so, but actually because we find real spiritual value in them. That becomes one of the seeds of the conflict that we call the English Civil War in the 1640s, which is fought on a number of lines, but the religious dividing line between those who want to defend that settlement as it stands and those who want to push through to a fully reformed settlement, becomes one of the bitterest of them. And it ultimately leads to the emergence of something that we can meaningfully call Anglicanism, which is a sort of cuckoo in the nest of the Church of England, which ends up taking over the whole thing and claiming its identity for itself.
So is it right that during the time of Elizabeth, there's sort of theologians who oppose Calvinistic doctrine but would consider themselves Protestants? I'm thinking of people like Richard Hooker, for example. Are those? Could you describe what those kind of sentiments are that and how they would differ?
Sure. I mean, Hooker is one of those people who's in subsequent history and Anglican identity has become this sort of dominating figure. He's a bit more obscure in his own time, and his great book, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, is only part published before his death. I mean, in fact, the text of the remainder of it is a bit problematic. He's writing mostly in the 1590s. There are then a series of others, this movement sort of beginning to gather strength in the following decades, and in particular under the first part of the reign of Charles I, from 1625 onwards, it really becomes dominant. And you're right; these folks are very clear that they are Protestants. That they would absolutely reject any notion that they're crypto papists or anything of that sort, and go out of their way to try and demonstrate their Protestant bona fides. Their argument, Hooker's argument, is explicitly that he represents a true Protestant approach, and the people who come to be called Puritans, he sees as having distorted or exaggerated certain features of what authentic Protestantism is. So, I mean, Anglicanism later lays claim to this notion of being a kind of middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. In the early 17th century, that would have sounded like claiming to pursue a middle way between good and evil. It's just, it's not a position anybody wants to lay hold of. There are one or two really daring folks amongst this movement who would claim to be pursuing a middle way between Rome and Geneva. But that's in the sense that they would say that the Genevan version of Protestantism is distorted and erroneous. We're doing it the right way. What are they actually substantially arguing about? Well, it's partly about royal authority, bishops versus presbyters, which is really about how independent and self-governing the church should be, or how much it should accept royal authority. That's a very big deal for Hooker, who's really concerned that many of these Puritan movements look seditious. The fact that they end up fighting a civil war against their king 40 years later he would have taken as an absolute vindication. So a lot of this is just about power. But there are theological issues, more kind of core doctrinal issues in there as well, of which predestination becomes one of the biggest ones. The Calvinist doctrine of predestination is kind of woven deeply into the structure of Calvinist theology. It has a powerful, both doctrinal and also pastoral logic behind it, but it's never been entirely stable or popular. And in the wake of a similar dispute amongst Calvinists in the Netherlands about pro and anti-predestination, there's an upsurge of anti-predestinarian thought in England, especially in the 1620s, and that becomes part of the doctrinal glue that holds this sort of diverse set of jurisdictional and also aesthetic claims together. One of the other things that helps to define this movement is a real taste for dignified liturgy, for polyphonic music, for the beautification of church furniture and so forth, which isn't a doctrinal issue in the same sort of way, but it's something that really affects the day-to-day experience of church life, and careers get made or broken over this sort of thing, over whether you're going to put up communion rails in your church or not, about vestments, what a minister wears in order to conduct public worship. Many of these are issues which people on both sides admit are trivial in themselves, but they become symbolic of bigger disputes.
So I don't know if this is a sort of appropriate point. It might be a bit of a kind of clunky change in pace, but I also another one of the kind of broad topics that's a part of what it is to be a Protestant is kind of the establishment of America, or even going back before it's known as America. The kind of colonies, or even the kind of Catholic aspects of it. I wanted to talk about what has the influence of Protestantism been on early America.
I mean, it is actually very much part of the same story. Of course, the European conquest and colonization of the Americas begins with the Catholic powers, with the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then the French are a little way behind, trying rather less successfully to make their way. Although actually there are French Protestants involved very early on in that process, very unsuccessfully.
What would they have been, like Anabaptists or something? Or
no, these are French Calvinists, French Huguenots, Calvinists early on in French Wars of Religion. They make a couple of attempts to establish colonies in the 1560s, which are one of them failed largely on its own. The other one is found by the Spanish and destroyed. But then the English begin trying to make settlements in the Americas from the 1580s onwards, after Francis Drake's round the world piracy expedition in the late 1570s. The Dutch are a little way behind on that, but actually, partly because their colonial ambitions are much more widely spread than just North America. They're setting up colonies in Brazil, in Southern Africa, and across large parts of Eastern Asia as well. And to begin with, these colonies are largely, commercial and trade focused, and there's talk of, we're going to establish, Christ's true religion on this continent, which has been filled with Catholic idolatry, but they don't do a whole lot about it. The real change in tempo there comes with the so-called Pilgrim Fathers in 1520. The foundation of the Plymouth colony, which is the beginning of New England. And these folks are religious refugees. And they've also got a commercial side to what they're doing. But above all, these are Puritans who, of one stripe or another, they're quite varied, who have found that the conservatism of the English church is no longer tolerable for them. Many of them had in fact already gone into exile in the Netherlands. And then this option opens up for them to establish an American colony. And the reason this is possible is because, unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese, England does its colonization on the cheap. It's not trying to establish direct rule in these areas, but is effectively willing to allow commercial ventures that are self-funding and which accept English sovereignty to set themselves up more or less on their own terms. And if that includes at least a degree of religious self-government, then so be it. And this is why the different colonies that spring up in North America during the 17th century each have their own distinct religious flavor. So you have Anglican Virginia, Quaker Pennsylvania, Catholic Maryland, or at least Catholic friendly Maryland, and then the Congregationalist territories in New England. And this initial rather small settlement in the 1620s, which is struggling to survive at the very beginning. I mean, they lose half of their people over the first winter. They have no idea how to cope with a New England winter. There's nothing like that in Western Europe. But then there's a much bigger surge of refugees start coming across in the 1530s, tens of thousands. Of English Puritans who find that Charles I's regime is really unacceptable to them and are seeking a haven.
Unacceptable in a religious sense.
Unacceptable in a religious sense, yeah. That they're being forced into a choice between conforming to a shifting church settlement which they see as idolatrous, or choosing exile. And especially now that the colony's set up, people have worked out how to survive these winters, at least to some extent. That prospect becomes much more appealing, and that leads to the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And John Winthrop, the first governor of that colony, makes this now famous speech where he declares this colony to be a city on a hill. It's pretty clear at the time that these folks were not actually terribly interested in going to America as such. It was just they needed somewhere to go, somewhere where they could be under English sovereignty, so they remained loyal English subjects, but also pursuing their their religion as they saw fit. There were other alternatives. A number go to Ireland. There's still the Netherlands, where of course they're foreigners, but for a great many, in that decade, North America is it. The interest in really seeing America itself as having some spiritual significance comes kind of a generation later, especially after the next great crisis for the American colonies, which is the English Civil War. And now the two great parties in England, the two religious parties, are at each other's throats, and the call goes out from Puritans in England to all these folks who've gone into exile: come back, we need you. This is you've gone, you found your place of safety, but now's the time to return home. Oliver Cromwell is of the view that the New England colonies are a distraction and a waste. He would like all of the New Englanders to move either to Ireland or maybe to Jamaica, somewhere where they could be more useful. And a great many of them do, not so many to Jamaica, but there's a big flow back eastwards across the Atlantic in the 1640s. It's really only by natural growth, by the fact that these colonies, people who settle there, become prosperous and have lots of children, that keeps the population rising over the mid 17th century. And that group start to discover a new set of spiritual meanings for this project. And then with the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 and the return to at least a degree of persecution of Puritans then, that meaning really hardens and sticks, and this sense of North America as a place with a distinct, clearly English but nevertheless distinct Protestant identity, which can hold on to this kind of vision of purity that England has failed to reach, really sticks. And another important part of that is the conquest of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which becomes renamed as New York at the beginning of the 1660s.
I only recently learned about Wall Street, and the reason that Wall Street being named Wall Street is because that's the wall at the edge of New Amsterdam.
Indeed. And of course, that brings in a really quite a big Dutch settler community, and these are Dutch Calvinists. And they remain Dutch-speaking and Calvinistic, for generations afterwards. So you've now got this really very plural religious community in the different English colonies in America. Okay, in the South they're mostly Anglicans, but from the Potomac northwards, you've got a much more eclectic group, varied not just between the colonies but within the colonies, because the Dutch Reformed Calvinists of New Amsterdam get overlaid with a new Anglican establishment, and it pretty quickly becomes clear that this is a place with no religious majority. And so when the colonies rise up in rebellion against their English governors in the 1770s, and this is a secular conflict. There's not really a strong religious element to it. They very quickly latch onto the assumption that they are not going to pursue any kind of uniform religious settlement. Some of the colonies of what becomes states do have an establishment of religion within themselves, but the assumption that there should be no religious establishment for the new United States as a whole is kind of woven in as the compromise that everybody can accept. because most of the religious communities are more afraid of somebody else trying to establish an establishment which is going to exclude them than they are ambitious to try to seize power in their own right. And you also, of course, by then have got a significant group of so-called deists, these folks of a more skeptical Enlightenment set of assumptions, who see religious tolerance and pluralism as a good thing in itself. So you have this kind of odd alliance between the skeptics and the really firm believers, who can agree on one thing, which is the non-establishment of religion. And then, of course, post the Civil War, that becomes devolved from the federal level to the state level as well. By then, there are no longer states with established religions anyway. But so you have this principle, which initially in the First Amendment is set up as one for the federal government only, and is then devolved down to the states and becomes spread much more thoroughly since. Of course, what began as this principle, which is there largely to protect religions from one another, to prevent any one of them securing a dominance that would marginalize the others. In modern times, it's become much more a principle about the place of formal religion within the public square at all. And so the contours of that struggle have changed, and certainly that kind of initial alliance between secularists and believers, obviously has kind of broken down.
So I suppose within this, and I think we've got about 15 more minutes to go, just in terms of you figuring out your timings and things for how to respond to this. The next thing that I also wanted to talk about was the slave trade, which involves obviously Britain and America, and is a very big sort of almost like a paradigmatic kind of moral case now. If you talk to anyone, it's kind of like the argumentum ad Hitlerum. Anyone can kind of point to Hitler as a paradigmatic case of you're doing wrong if you can form some sort of analogy in some way. And slavery is similarly one of those cases. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, firstly, how is Christianity sort of associated with that, and how is it associated with both justifications for slavery after the fact, because you mentioned the Civil War in America, but also how is it associated with people who are pushing, to do away with slavery? And I suppose that's predominantly a British story first, but we can.
It's a huge, really important question. You're absolutely right to emphasize the way that it's become in modern times, since let's say the mid-19th century, a kind of unquestioned touchstone of our ethical consensus. We don't need to debate whether slavery is legitimate or is a good thing. We know the answer to that. But it's really important to understand that until say the late 18th century at the earliest, for most people that's just not the case. Slavery is one of those human phenomena that's a fact of life. It's sometimes compared to poverty, in the sense that it's regrettable and nobody would want it for themselves, but it's just there. And you can't click your fingers and wish it away. And there are a few voices. Quakers become some of the earliest of these, who begin to say, not that slavery should be abolished, because that's a question so sort of big that it's almost inconceivable, but who start to say, we don't want slavery here in this particular place where we are. We think it's wrong for Quakers to hold slaves, or to participate in the slave trade. That remains very much a marginal position. And by the time Protestants get seriously into it in the mid 17th century, the transatlantic slave trade is already a big, dominant industrial concern, with many thousands of Africans being shipped, across the Atlantic to the Americas to form the workforce initially of the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies. And when the Protestant powers start to set up colonies of their own right, initially in the Caribbean and then on the American mainland, they are buying into an industrial system, an economic system, which depends on slavery. There are a number of attempts to set up Protestant colonies which don't use slavery. That's partly because of a genuine distaste for bonded labor, which there's quite a lot of evidence early on of Protestants saying that we really don't like this. This is ugly. And also because of a distaste for filling these Protestant utopias that they're creating with a load of pagans. They want religious purity, and all these Africans, as far as they're concerned, represent impurity. So being opposed to slavery doesn't necessarily mean that you're embracing a kind of position that would look acceptable nowadays. And all of these attempts to create a slave-free colonial system fail, and they fail, really for economic reasons, because it's very hard to compete with a workforce which doesn't need to be paid and who can be worked literally to death. The colony of Georgia becomes one of the most earnest and serious attempts, founded in the mid-1730s, to try to create a colony which is going to run without slavery, for there's a mixture of reasons that I talked about. And after 15 years, the governors of the colony have to give in. They just cannot make the economics of the place work, and there are slave traders knocking on their door, willing to sell them people who they can buy and make their system pay for itself in a way that they just otherwise could not. So for most of the 18th century, slavery just seems like a ghastly fact of life. And the primary concern for Protestants, at least for those Protestants who allow themselves to think about this as a problem, and that is not terribly many of them, it's best to just try and forget about it as far as many of them are concerned. The primary concern is not how do we get rid of slavery, because that seems just inconceivable, and it would mean destroying the economic basis of their whole societies. But how can we make it more civilized? And in particular, how can we Christianize these people? And there are many hand-wringing debates back and forth against that, which all founder on essentially the same problem, which is that the slaveholders themselves are mostly, there are a few exceptions, staunchly opposed to attempts to make Christians of the people that they have enslaved. Partly because there are residual fears that enslaved people who are baptized will try to claim their freedom on that basis, although it quickly becomes pretty clear there's no legal basis for them to do so. But more, it's hard to get away from the sense that they worry that enslaved people who become Christians will learn ideas of spiritual equality and start asserting their dignity in those terms, even if it means something as minimal as demanding time off to attend worship on Sunday, and also wanting to learn to read so that they can read the Bible. And the idea of slave literacy is one that the slave-owning classes find deeply threatening, because they're well aware that they're in a society where literacy is one of the primary routes for accessing power. In many slave societies, it is a crime for an enslaved person to attempt to learn to read, or for a free person to try to teach an enslaved person to read.
That's so crazy. But
well, it's.
I mean, I understand the rationale behind it. I mean,
I wouldn't say it's crazy. It's got a it's got a kind of ironclad logic to it.
Yeah.
It's horrible, but that's
what. Yeah.
Then quite suddenly, in the 1770s and in particular in the 1780s, there's a real sea change, especially in England, although it's paralleled in some parts of the newly independent American colonies. When these repeated attempts to try to civilize or sort of beautify the slave process are understood to have failed, and the demand that initially the slave trade itself, rather than slavery as such, should be abolished, moves very quickly from the margins to the mainstream. And it's been, I think, convincingly argued that the key thing that makes that possible is American independence, for two reasons. One, because within the British Empire, the removal of the American colonies means that a major pro-slavery lobby no longer has to be placated. You've still got the slaveholders in the Caribbean, but without their mainland allies, they're much less powerful. But the other reason is that the fact of defeat by the rebellious American colonies in the 1770s and early 80s, which is a real shock to the British establishment. They do not expect this bunch of jumped up colonials to be able to fight off the might of the British Empire. And okay, they have French help, but even so. And so naturally, the question that good Protestants begin asking themselves is, if we have faced this catastrophe, that's a judgment from God. We're being punished for something. What might it be? And slavery starts to look like the kind of national crime for which they're being judged. And there's a couple of really high-profile, ghastly scandals in the early 1780s, which then the small group in England who have been trying to raise awareness of what's actually going on in the slave trade. Some of them, white English folks, but also crucial voices for a handful of former enslaved people who've managed to acquire their liberty by one means or another and have become really articulate spokespeople for the abolitionist cause. They succeed in raising awareness and producing this tremendously powerful abolitionist movement, really almost from nowhere. Of course, it's one thing to produce a mass movement; it's another thing for it actually to succeed. The campaign against the slave trade in Britain is fought out in Parliament and in the public square for over 20 years before that the Act is finally passed in 1807. You then don't have abolition of actual slavery in the British Empire until the end of the 1830s. And there's a comparably slow process in most of the other imperial settings. The final abolition of slavery anywhere in the Atlantic world is in Brazil in 1888. Of course, the best known one is the way it plays out in the United States, where it ultimately produces the crisis of the Civil War. It's a very unusual case, that one. In every other jurisdiction where slavery is abolished, it's a deal that's made between a government that eventually says, no, this has got to stop, and a relatively small, wealthy slaveholding elite who are resisting it. And in each case, the way it's resolved is that the slaveholders are bought out. They're financially compensated for the loss of their property.
still not money paid to the slaves, notably.
No. I mean, nobody even thinks of the possibility of compensating the enslaved people for what had happened to them. Whereas in the United States, of course, nobody is compensated. Instead, as Lincoln famously puts it, the price is paid in blood. And when slavery is abolished, it's that abolition is enforced at gunpoint, effectively, onto the defeated Southern states. So, I mean, I think it's worth remembering when we're looking at the legacies of slavery, both religious and secular, across the whole Atlantic world, how exceptional the American experience is in those and in many other ways. One of the other key differences being that by the time slavery is abolished in most other jurisdictions, it was already failing as an economic system, and so the wind is behind the abolitionists in those sense. Whereas American slavery, based as it was around cotton, was economically thriving, and you know, indeed the slave population the enslaved population was growing. So, you know, I'm not generally a fan of American exceptionalism in many ways. I think, you know, the United States is much more closely woven into the rest of the world than it sometimes likes to think. But in this case, the American experience really is unusual, and the experience of formerly enslaved populations in the Caribbean and in many other parts of the Atlantic world shouldn't be too quickly analogized to those that emerge in the United States.
Great. So thank you for answering all those questions. I had one, there it is. I had one question that someone put across earlier in a super chat. So I just wondered if you could quickly answer this, and then I'll let you go. Gary deNysschen asks, my eventual question for Prof. Ryrie, what is his take on the fascinating Pierre Bayle, whose dictionary was read so many ways by different readers? And could you say what it is for those of us who...
Sure. I mean, it's a good question, and not one that deserves a longer answer than I'll be able to give it now. Pierre Bayle was a French Protestant, French Huguenot, who in the 1690s published his philosophical dictionary, you know, one of a series of works he produced in that, you know, generation, which make him one of the sort of heralds of what comes to be called the radical Enlightenment, the more kind of skeptical, anti-religious establishment wing of that movement. There's a real debate about Bayle, whether he has been called and claimed as an atheist, and I suspect this may be the debate that the question's referring to. He never admitted to being an atheist, and always laid hold of this claim to be a Huguenot, to be a Protestant. But it's certainly clear that he's not a very orthodox Protestant. For myself, I'm inclined, and I'm here following the line taken in, I think, a really compelling book by Dominic Erdős called The Soul of Doubt, that was published 5-6 years ago now, who I think makes a very convincing case that Bayle is a sincere and convinced Protestant Christian, but one who finds his doctrine centered much more around the ethical example of Jesus, rather than around Protestant doctrine as it's traditionally formulated. And in that sense, he's in a strand of radical Christian critique of conventional Christian orthodoxy, which to some extent goes back to Luther himself. You know, idea of using Jesus as a way of critiquing Christianity is hardly an original. Christianity as it's practiced is hardly an original one. I mean, it's a kind of perennial Christian movement. But the radical strand within which Bayle stands, I mean, he uses this to argue firmly, in particular for religious toleration and against religious coercion of any kind, which becomes one of his really decisive issues. Not a controversial issue amongst Christians nowadays. At the time, very much was. That sort of structure at the time looked atheistic. I think the case that he saw it as a profoundly and necessarily authentically Christian understanding is pretty strong. Whether he, as a result, ended up giving comfort to and creating room for the kind of atheisms that would go on to emerge over the following centuries, I think you could make a strong case for that as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks for answering. I know we've gone a little bit over time there. In terms of the content of the last interview that we did and this one, the book is Protestants, the Radicals That Made the Modern World, if people want to go and check that out. I think, is it more recently you also did an Atlas of Christianity? Is that
That's right. And I mean, for the stuff about Bayle, I'm more drawing on another book I did recently called Unbelievers,
right,
which is about
an emotional history of doubt. That was
precise.
And then, is there anything else that you'd want to promote? Obviously, the great Gresham lecture series that you've got out there. I think there's a dedicated.
Yeah, there's going to be another one of those starting. The first one of the next series is going to be on the 22nd of September.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and I will end it there. If you want to hang around for a second, I'm just going to play the closing credits, and then that'll be it.
Thanks.